They said the enemy was gone forever. For decades, the galaxy whispered of their disappearance like ghosts swallowed by time. Humanity built, expanded, dreamed, but never forgot. And then the stars trembled. Across the void, they returned. Their ships did not merely blot out the suns, they eclipsed worlds themselves. Metal citadels the size of continents drifted through the dark, carrying a silence more terrifying than any weapon. Entire fleets vanished before a single shot was fired. Yet, in the shadow of these titans, a lone human stood at the edge of the abyss. Not a soldier forged in legend, not a commander of fleets, just one voice among billions. And still, in that moment, they carried the weight of all humanity. Because when giants return to claim the stars, it is not the size of their warships that decides the future. It is the will of those who dare to resist. So the question becomes, when warships larger than worlds descend upon us, will humanity break, or will we rise? Captain Elias Ward never thought the stars would feel so quiet. From the bridge of the Dauntless, he stared out across the endless sweep of black. 1,000 pinpricks of light shimmered beyond the glass. Stars, colonies, worlds humanity had claimed in the long decades since the war ended. He had been born in that peace, raised on a mining outpost where the loudest sound was the groan of drills in ice and stone. The war was only something his grandfather muttered about, half warning, half memory. "They'll be back," the old man used to say, voice cracked and eyes clouded. "Don't think they're gone forever. The silence is only the breath before the storm." Elias had laughed then, like any child would. But now, years later, with command stripes on his shoulder and the responsibility of lives in his hands, he remembered those words more often than he cared to admit. The Dauntless wasn't a battleship. She was a patrol frigate. Sleek, fast, her crew more accustomed to scanning shipping lanes and keeping smugglers honest than engaging in war. Life aboard was steady, almost monotonous. Cards in the mess, maintenance drills, watching the sensors hum. Elias liked it that way. Peace meant his crew slept through the night. Peace meant they returned home to their families. But beneath the routine, an unease gnawed at him. It wasn't the kind of fear you could point to, more like the memory of a shadow you swore you'd seen in the corner of your eye. Supply convoys had reported strange readings. A mining station at the edge of Perseus Reach had gone silent. No distress call, no debris, just nothing. Most dismissed it as pirates. Others blamed equipment failure. But Elias knew better. He'd seen the raw edges in his crew's smiles, the way veterans of the old war stiffened whenever the silence dragged on too long. They had lived through the disappearance. They remembered the enemy who had once burned half a sector before vanishing without a trace. The official line was simple. They were gone. Extinct, destroyed, swallowed by their own hubris. But the stars had a way of keeping secrets. "Captain, we're clear of the relay drift," Lieutenant Ramirez said, breaking the silence. Her hands danced across the console, eyes fixed on the scanner readouts. "All systems normal. No contacts within range." Elias nodded, forcing a smile. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Yet even as he said it, his gaze drifted to the viewport. Beyond the glass, a star flared, then dimmed. A trick of distance? A dying sun? Or something else? He remembered his grandfather's voice again. "The silence is only the breath before the storm." That night, in his quarters, Elias pulled up the old records. He wasn't supposed to. Classified archives buried beneath decades of peace. But curiosity gnawed harder than fear. Images flickered across his display. Fleets swallowed whole, cities burned to ash, and ships so vast their shadows swallowed moons. Humanity had survived not because of strength, but because the enemy had vanished. And no one ever answered why. Elias closed the file with a shiver. The system clock marked another day's end, another uneventful patrol. His crew laughed down the corridor, unworried, unburdened. He envied them. But sleep did not come easily. He dreamed of shadows blotting out the stars, of engines that roared like collapsing suns. He dreamed of warships bigger than worlds. And when the alarm klaxons dragged him awake 3 hours later, the pit in his stomach told him it wasn't just a dream. The enemy had returned. The Dauntless shuddered as the alarms howled. Captain Elias Ward stumbled into the command deck, uniform half-fastened, heart hammering against his ribs. His crew was already at their stations, faces pale in the crimson light. "Report!" Elias barked, steadying himself against the rail. "Unknown contact," Ramirez said, voice tight. Her hands flew across her console, feeding sensor data onto the main screen. It appeared on long-range scans, and then it blocked the scan entirely. Blocked it? Elias frowned. Nothing blocks a sweep like that. Her jaw clenched. Unless it's big. The main display flickered, and suddenly the stars were gone. At least it looked that way. A wall of black stretched across half the view, studded with scattered glimmers like dying embers. At first, Elias thought it was a sensor error, some kind of interference. But then the silhouette shifted, and the stars vanished for real. The crew stared in silence. It wasn't a ship. Ships had form, symmetry, a logic to their design. This thing was a floating continent of jagged metal and impossible geometry, so vast it seemed to drag gravity itself. A planetary mass turned into a fortress. Cities built upon the hull, spires reaching into void, weapons arrays spanning kilometers. "Dear God," Ramirez whispered. That's not possible." "Size?" Elias forced the word out. Her console chirped in protest, struggling to process the numbers. Captain, it's bigger than Europa, bigger than Luna. That's not a warship, that's a world," Elias finished. A world that moved. The Dauntless was a frigate, fast and sleek, but beside this thing, they were a gnat beside a leviathan. And yet the leviathan had noticed them. Energy rippled along its flanks, vast conduits glowing like rivers of molten fire. Elias's skin prickled. That wasn't a weapons lock, that was a storm building. "Helm!" Elias snapped. "Get us out of range, now!" Thrusters roared, but the black fortress didn't even flinch. It simply drifted, slow and deliberate, as if aware that no prey could outrun its shadow. Elias forced calm into his voice. "Signal command, priority Alpha. Tell them the silence is broken." The comm officer's fingers danced over the console, transmitting every scrap of data they had. Elias prayed it would reach anyone before the thing decided to erase them. Seconds stretched into eternity. The ship's engines screamed as they pulled the Dauntless away from the edge of that abyss. The sensors still wailed, unable to even measure the full breadth of the thing behind them. And then, mercifully, it did not pursue. The enemy had returned, but they weren't here for a single patrol ship. They were here for everything. Hours later, Elias stood before the Hollow Council of Sector Command. Transmission feeds flickered. Admirals, ministers, governors, all speaking at once. Fear hung over the chamber like a suffocating fog. "You're certain of this?" one admiral demanded. "It wasn't a sensor anomaly?" Elias set his jaw. "We saw it with our eyes. My crew can testify. A vessel larger than worlds, armed and moving under its own power." "They vanished for 30 years, another voice cut in. "Why return now?" "That's the wrong question," Elias said grimly. "The real question is, how many of them are there?" The chamber fell silent. And then, as if to answer, the feeds lit up with new reports. A colony in the Antares system. Gone dark. A listening post near the Helion Rift. Silent. A civilian convoy on the Orion trade lane. Lost. One by one, systems winked out like candles in a storm. Elias felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest. This wasn't a raid. It wasn't a probe. This was an invasion. A return long prepared, patient, and precise. And humanity wasn't ready. The first battle came at Vera Prime. Vera was a jewel of the outer colonies, home to 12 million souls and ringed with orbital platforms. The defense fleet, 15 cruisers, 40 escorts, and a half-dozen battleships waited in formation as the enemy arrived. Elias watched through a secure feed, every nerve in his body taut. The fortress ship emerged from void space like a nightmare dragging itself into the light. Its hull swallowed the orbitals in shadow. The defenders opened fire, a wall of missiles, plasma, railgun slugs, a storm meant to shred anything that dared approach. The storm broke against the Leviathan like rain against stone. Shields, if they could be called that, absorbed the barrage, glowing faintly before vanishing as if nothing had touched them. Then came the counterstrike. A single lance of light carved across the fleet. One battleship, then another, then 3 more, all gone in an instant. The orbitals cracked and fell burning into the atmosphere below. Elias heard the screams through open comms. He gritted his teeth, unable to tear his eyes away. The fortress didn't just destroy fleets, it erased them. Yet amidst the chaos, humanity fought. One cruiser, engines burning, rammed its prow into the fortress's flank, detonating every warhead in its belly. The explosion lit the void brighter than a sun. For a heartbeat, hope surged. And then the fire cleared, revealing barely a scorch mark. The fortress swatted the cruiser's sacrifice aside and drifted onward. Vera burned that night. But humans are stubborn creatures, and stubbornness breeds ingenuity. Command began pulling every archive, every scrap of data from the old war. If brute force couldn't break these titans, then something else had to. Patterns were studied, energy signatures dissected. Every myth, every rumor from veterans of the last conflict was brought back into the light. Elias found himself summoned to lead a task force, not because of his rank, but because he had seen the Leviathan and lived to tell it. He didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a survivor. But humanity needed survivors who could become something more. On the eve of departure, Ramirez approached him. "Sir," she said quietly, "what chance do we really have?" Elias hesitated. He thought of his grandfather's words, of shadows blotting out the stars. He thought of Vera burning. And then he thought of the cruiser that had rammed the fortress, not because it was ordered to, but because someone on that bridge refused to surrender. He looked her in the eye. "We don't need to match their size. We just need to find the crack. Every fortress has one." She nodded, though fear lingered in her gaze. The task force deployed into the Perseus Reach, where reports said another fortress ship had appeared. The Dauntless and her sister frigates flew ahead, scouts darting in and out of shadow. Sensors screamed as the Leviathan loomed once more, its presence a wound in the stars. But this time, Elias did not order retreat. "Get me full spectrum analysis," he commanded. "Heat, radiation, gravimetric distortion. I want to see how this thing breathes." Data poured in. The Leviathan's systems pulsed with a rhythm, vast energy flows cycling like a heartbeat. Shields, weapons, propulsion, all tied to that rhythm. And in that rhythm, Elias saw something. A flicker. A hesitation. Barely a fraction of a second when one system faltered as another surged. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Mark that window," Elias said, his voice steel. "That's where we hit them." The plan was reckless, desperate, exactly what humans excelled at. Small strike groups would dart in close, baiting the Leviathan to fire. At the exact moment the cycle shifted, every ship would unleash their payload into the same point. Not enough to break the giant, but maybe enough to wound it. The crew braced themselves as the Dauntless plunged into the shadow of the fortress. The void lit with fire as the Leviathan stirred, weapons lashing out like the hands of a god. Escorts vanished in bursts of light, frigates torn apart mid-maneuver. Still, the survivors pressed on, weaving through destruction. "Almost there," Ramirez whispered, eyes locked on the timer. The Leviathan's glow surged, shields cycling. "Now!" Elias roared. Every missile, every slug, every ounce of fury humanity had left slammed into the same patch of armor. For the first time, the Leviathan flinched. Metal screamed, plating buckled, a wound torn open in its endless hull. It wasn't destroyed, not even close, but it bled. And that was enough. The humans cheered even as more ships died around them, because they had proved the giants weren't invincible. Elias gripped the railing, sweat on his brow, eyes blazing. "They can be hurt," he said softly. "That means they can be killed." But even as the wounded Leviathan drifted back into shadow, another emerged from the void beside it, bigger, darker, and unscarred. The bridge fell silent. The crew stared at the screens, horror creeping into their bones. One Leviathan had nearly broken them. Now there were two. Elias's throat tightened. The galaxy had just learned a terrible truth. The enemy hadn't returned with a single fortress. They had returned with an armada. The two Leviathans drifted together like gods crossing the void, their shadows blotting out the stars. One bore the wound humanity had carved into its flank, molten metal bleeding light into the abyss. The other was pristine, untouched, unscarred, a reminder of how far the galaxy still had to fall. On the bridge of the Dauntless, silence reigned. Elias Ward gripped the railing until his knuckles burned. His crew waited for his orders, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Fear was everywhere, thick and suffocating. But beneath it, Elias felt something sharper, something older. Defiance. "We've proved they can bleed," he said, voice steady despite the storm within him. "Now we show them we don't stop fighting." "Sir," Ramirez whispered, "we can't take on two of them. Not with what's left." "I know," Elias said. His gaze locked on the scarred Leviathan. "That's why we're going to kill one." The task force rallied, broken ships dragging themselves back into formation. Survivors who had lost half their fleets, engineers patching hulls with bare hands, gunners loading the last of their shells. They all knew the odds, and still they came. Because humanity had always been at its most dangerous when the night seemed darkest. Elias outlined the plan. Concentrate everything on the wounded Leviathan, exploit the weakness they had opened, widen the wound until even giants had to fall. The second fortress would respond, of course, but if they could destroy one, the message would echo across the galaxy. Humanity fights back. The order was given. Engines roared, weapons primed. The ragged fleet surged forward. The Leviathans stirred. Their shields pulsed like heartbeats, their weapons arrays lit with rivers of fire. One wounded, one whole. Together they turned their wrath upon the insects daring to resist. The first volley tore through the human formation. Frigates disintegrated. Cruisers shattered. The void burned with debris and bodies. Still, the survivors pressed on, weaving through the storm with desperate brilliance, jamming sensors, scattering decoys, darting into blind spots only humans would be reckless enough to exploit. "Target window approaching," Ramirez shouted. "Hold," Elias commanded. His eyes burned as the fortress loomed larger, filling the screen with jagged metal and bleeding light. He could feel the crew's terror, but also their faith. They would follow him into hell if he asked. "Now!" The fleet unleashed its fury. Missiles screamed, railguns thundered, plasma lanced into the wound. The Leviathan howled, its hull rupturing, internal fires spilling into the dark. The scar widened into a chasm, tearing through decks the size of cities. "Hit confirmed!" Ramirez cried. The crew erupted in cheers. For the first time, the Titan recoiled, staggering in the void. Its weapons faltered, a colossal armory choking on its own damage. But the victory was short-lived. The unscarred Leviathan moved. Its lance of light carved across the battlefield, annihilating 2 cruisers and shearing half the Dauntless's shields away. The deck pitched violently. Sparks rained from shattered panels. Elias slammed into the railing, tasting blood. "Shields at 30%, Ramirez shouted. "They'll never let us finish it," the helm officer cried. "The second one's covering it." Elias forced himself to his feet. His vision swam, but his mind was clear. They couldn't win by attrition. They needed something bigger, something final. His gaze fell on the reactor status. The Dauntless's core was running hot, unstable after the barrage. A dangerous thought burned in his mind. Ramirez saw it in his eyes. "Sir, no. Don't even say it." "It's the only way," Elias said quietly. "We get close. We take the wound and drive the Dauntless straight into its heart. Our reactor goes critical inside their hull, and even giants can't walk away from that." The bridge went silent. The crew stared, horror and resolve battling in their eyes. "Captain," Ramirez's voice cracked, "that's suicide." Elias looked at her, at each face on the bridge. "It's survival. Not for me. For humanity. If we kill one, the galaxy knows they can die. And if they can die, they can be defeated." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, the crew nodded. Fear still lingered, but it was swallowed by something greater. Purpose. The Dauntless dove into the maelstrom, engines screaming, shields flickering as the Leviathans rained destruction around them. Escorts threw themselves into the path of enemy fire, buying seconds at the cost of their lives. The scarred Leviathan loomed larger and larger, its wound glowing like the mouth of hell. 30 seconds to core overload," Ramirez reported, her voice steady now. Elias gripped the railing, eyes locked on the target. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "The silence is only the breath before the storm." Well, humanity was the storm now. The battle was over. Or at least that's what the silence suggested. No more alarms, no more cannon fire, just the quiet hum of systems too shocked to realize they were still alive. Captain Elias stood at the viewport, hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring out into the void where, minutes ago, an alien armada had loomed. Now it was little more than drifting debris, broken hulls, fading firelight, shattered giants once thought eternal. And in their place, humanity's ships still stood, scarred, bruised, but standing. The crew barely breathed. Many were too exhausted to cheer, too stunned to even speak. Victory was not supposed to look like this. They weren't supposed to survive against fleets older than Earth's nations. They weren't supposed to defy ships the size of continents. Yet, here they were. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, not in triumph, but in reverence. He thought of the names on the casualty lists already compiling in the system. He thought of the ones who hadn't made it. And then, just as quickly, he thought of what those sacrifices meant. Humanity still had a future. A comms officer whispered, voice trembling, "Sir, the enemy transmission, it's still broadcasting." Elias nodded. He knew what it was. The alien command structure, broken but defiant, sending out its final threat. A voice boomed across the comms. "You are ants. You are nothing. The war is not over." The bridge went silent, every human ear fixed on the words. Elias straightened. His voice was raw but steady. "No. The war is over. Not because you surrendered, not because we destroyed you, but because you underestimated us. You thought humans could be erased, that we would break. But humanity endures. We are the storm you never prepared for, and we will not be forgotten. His words carried across the crew, across the battered fleet, across the survivors who needed something, anything, to hold on to. For a long moment there was no reply. Then the alien signal cut out. The crew finally exhaled, and slowly, as if afraid to break the fragile silence, the first cheer rose. It was ragged, hoarse, almost painful, but it grew and grew until the bridge was alive with the sound of exhausted, broken, living humans celebrating the impossible. Elias didn't join them. Not yet. He kept his eyes fixed on the stars, on the path ahead. The enemy wasn't truly gone. They would regroup. They would return. But when they did, the galaxy would remember this day, because humanity had stood against giants and won. Days later, when the casualty reports were finalized and the wreckage catalogued, historians would write that it was the turning point, that this was when humanity stepped out of its fragile infancy and into the legacy of the stars, that it was here, among shattered titans, that humans claimed their place not as victims, not as stragglers, but as equals. Elias would never see himself as a hero. He would remember the faces of those he lost more clearly than the voices cheering his name. But he would carry something else, too. The knowledge that every battle, every sacrifice, every impossible stand had built towards something greater. Humanity had proven it could endure the unendurable. It had proven that when faced with annihilation, it could fight back. It had proven that size wasn't strength, that the human spirit, fragile, reckless, defiant, was stronger than fleets, bigger than worlds. And that knowledge spread. Alien civilizations that had once dismissed Earth as irrelevant now whispered about the Terrans. Traders spoke of their impossible victory. Diplomats spoke of alliances. Enemies spoke of fear. For decades, humanity had been missing, lost in obscurity. Now they had returned to the galaxy, and they were no longer small. They were no longer overlooked. They were no longer prey. They were a people who had faced down giants and refused to die. Elias finally allowed himself to breathe. The war ahead would be long. But humanity had something no alien empire could quantify, no AI could simulate, no Titan could crush. Hope. And in the end, hope was enough, because humanity was here to stay, and the stars would never forget it.